He woke with someone else's cigarette ash in the hollow of his palm and a band of cold metal that shouldn't have been there, heavy against his finger, as certain and absurd as a lighthouse in a desert. The diner's neon hummed through cracked blinds and painted his skin a sickly blue. The vinyl booth smelled like coffee and old gasoline. Marco Silva blinked into the face of a waitress who was folding his napkin with the brisk efficiency of someone who had seen too many men fall asleep in booths, and he tried to remember how he had come to be married. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. He fumbled at the ring like a thief surprised at his own loot. Gold, thin, unadorned, the sort of thing that fits too neatly under the hard, calloused knuckle of a life lived at speed. He could feel the skin where it pressed, the little heat mark of something that had been there for more than the afternoon. Panic rose like bile. He didn't remember a wedding. He didn't remember falling asleep in the back of a diner that smelled of burnt toast and exhaust. He did remember her hands, weathered with veins that mapped like old roadways, the nails filed short but kept, a palm that had once steadied a throttle and later soothed a dying machine. She had slipped it on his finger with a smile that felt like a confession. Evelyn Mama Red Duarte had the kind of name you heard before you saw her, like a low roar at the edge of town before the bike appeared. Word of her moved like a second highway, a widow who had kept her husband's patch alive when others thought the road would swallow it, president of a clutch of repair shops that looked after more than engines, a keeper of deaths and oaths, and the ledger that smelled faintly of oil and tobacco. She walked like a woman who had made peace with being a legend and kept enough softness to whistle when she worked. Marco had fallen for her the way someone falls into a sunspot, by accident and then irrevocably. He loved the way she sang to engines, an oddly lullaby cadence that calmed a temperamental carburetor as easily as it softened her voice. He loved the way she smiled at the road, like it was their old friend and also something she meant to beat into shape. He was half her age and 1,000 lifetimes older in the ways that counted. The ocean had carved lines into his face faster than the years had, and his hands were already fastened to grease. Marco knew engines and loneliness with equal fluency. He could fix a seized camshaft and solder together a plan to keep from being hollowed out. He'd never expected marriage to be possible under a woman's patch, but when Evelyn had asked, soft as dusk, firm as a wrench, he had said yes because the answer felt like shelter. For him, it was shelter and defiance, a quiet rebellion against the small betrayals of life, a way to claim warmth before grief could reclaim her again. For her, Marco suspected, it was a stubborn act of trying on tenderness, as if it were a jacket she hadn't known she could still wear. Now, the ring on his finger felt like a signal flare. The waitress, a woman named Angie who had seen men arrive drunk and leave ashamed, watched him with the patience of someone cataloging accidents. "You okay, baby?" she asked. Her voice was flat and curious and somewhere affectionate. She kept lost sweaters behind the counter and had a soft spot for men who were younger than the trouble they carried. "Where am I?" Marco asked, and his own voice sounded like it belonged to someone whose throat had been through a fight. "Diner on 3rd, she said. "Last night you were carrying on about how the jukebox had bad taste in love songs, and then you kissed Mama Red's hand like she was the saint of mufflers. She left this morning with you in a bag. Said you two had something to figure out." Mama Red. The name lodged in him like a dumbbell and pulled everything fluorescent into focus. He remembered her hands on his wrist, the way she had steadied him after a bottle of whiskey had unrolled too fast and too many memories fell out.
He remembered the low altar, if a bar stool and a scratched counter could be called that. And the way she'd laughed, small and incredulous, like a woman who had spent half her life hiding a need and then decided she'd had enough of hiding. He remembered her slipping the ring onto his finger and saying nothing more than, "Then we'll see." He remembered a song on the jukebox that wasn't a song at all, but a radio play he'd heard a dozen times, only now it felt like an offering. "She left married," he said finally, and the words were both confession and accusation. The waitress unfolded his napkin and left a coffee cup like a lifeline. Marco sat up and the world tilted. He felt older in an instant, the fool's sudden gravity of a man who had moved into a role before understanding the terms. He looked at the tablet of orders tacked to the wall, at the grease-smeared counters, at the faded photograph of Evelyn hanging behind the pastry case. Red hair caught in a bandana, face wind-bitten and proud. The iconic patch, a red phoenix curved around a wrench, stitched on her leather jacket like a map of the coast. The memory repaired itself in fragments. Evelyn in the shop at dawn, a cigarette between her lips while she tightened a bolt by feel. Her laugh when he tried to teach her a trick to balance a carburetor. How she teased him for being sentimental about engines, even as she battered them into submission with honeyed curses. She had told him once, with a softness he hadn't been primed to receive, that he was welcome anywhere in her life. He had taken that as invitation. She had taken his steady companionship as the answer to a loneliness that had been a worship all those funeral years. He had not asked enough questions. He had not asked what it meant for him to wear her name. He had not asked because he wanted a place to be, a badge that said family. If her patch had been a map, he had stepped over its borders unknowingly. The road beyond his garage was ridden with old scores and a ledger whose margin notes would rearrange the fates of everyone who read it. Evelyn's ledger was the kind of thing that bled people dry and sometimes bled them out. It was an arcane, practical book. Lists of favors traded like currency, names scrawled beside inked amounts they owed in trust or blood. She kept it in a drawer with a lock that had multiple keys. She told him once, laughing darkly, that being the woman with the ledger meant you carried the town's crooked heartbeat in your palm. To him, that had sounded like responsibility. To others, particularly to rivals, it sounded like a target. There had always been something taut under the rumble of Evelyn's life. When her husband died a decade ago in a gravel-splattered border shootout, she had kept the patch from folding. She stitched his absence into a rule book and taught the men under her, forbearance, to be precise in their loyalties. She brokered a truce with a rival club, the Red Banner, after a man from their side had been killed and the blood demanded a ledger of debts. It was a truce written in a language of grudges and pavement, and if anything in that truce had ever been broken, the scar would still be raw. Tomas Vega, a name that tasted like rusted iron and fever, was the young wolf who had risen through the Red Banner's ranks. He was younger than Evelyn and far meaner in the way that comes from not knowing how to wear brief like armor. He wanted to expand the banner's borders and reshape the coastline in his own image. Tomas hated that a woman, especially a woman his age, could hold power that touched his plans. He hated that Evelyn's patch had outlasted her husband's body and that she dared to smile like she had a right to the road. And in the months before Marco woke ringed in a diner, Tomas had been making moves, cracking small bones and breaking tires in towns between their territories, leaving calling cards that were meant to be read as promises. Marco had no idea any of that had anything to do with him. He had always been more scared of losing Evelyn's company than of her enemies. He worried about being a burden, worried that his presence with her patched themselves into some grotesque comedy of age. He'd invented narratives where he was a son or a brother. He hadn't imagined himself as bait. He had said yes because every time he'd near touch a plan to leave, he found himself circling back to the garage where she kept a kettle warm and the guys swapped stories like currency. Evelyn came back through the diner's door an hour later, leaning on a cane she usually used as a joke when she wanted to puncture the idea that she was slow. The room seemed to hush as she crossed it, not out of fear, but out of acknowledgement. She wore the phoenix patch over her heart and a jacket that showed age in the way leather does, not softened but seasoned. Marco watched her approach with the slow astonishment of a man who has been given an unexpected map to a hidden city. Her eyes, a steel gray, held his with something like reproach softened by a matching tenderness. "You're wearing it wrong," she said without preamble, and he realized she meant the ring. She reached across the table and straightened his band with a finger that smelled faintly of oil and lemon. "Don't fidget, looks bad, and don't go talking to the press." "I didn't," Marco started, then paused.
Press? What press? He thought of nights at her shop, of prospect boys who sometimes brought gossip like pay sheets, of rival clubs that listened to the soft static between engines. "I don't remember. Why did you?" She gave him that half-smile that the world around her had come to call permission. Because when a woman your age sees a man whose eyes have bent toward being lonely like a habit, she either sells him a chain or gives him a place at the table. You looked like you needed a name, and I looked like I needed someone who could hold a wrench and shut his mouth when the wrong kind of men asked questions. Her voice was honest and dangerous in the same breath. Marco felt a warmth that had nothing to do with his coffee. Relief collided with guilt. He loved that she protected him with the blunt force of ownership. He hated that she had become accustomed to making choices that extended into other people's lives without consulting them. He wanted to ask what else had been decided without his consent and feared the ledger open on the table between them. "People are going to talk," Evelyn added. "That's always the first thing to worry about. The second is that some people will think I married up by picking you. The third," she leaned in, lowering her voice to a tone that Marco had never quite heard from her before, the tone of a woman speaking to someone she was teaching to read a map for the first time. "The third is that making me soft is a strategy my enemies will exploit. Tomas Vega doesn't see me as a woman who loved a man. He sees me as a patch to be torn off a jacket." The name thudded in the air like a fist on a table. Marco felt the ring grow a degree colder, as if the metal had absorbed a threat. Tomas Vega? His voice made it sound like a rumor that belonged to someone else. This was city politics he'd never been part of. Territories and code, and men whose names were written in nights of blood. "You paid for kindness without asking the cost," Evelyn said lightly, but her eyes were storm-dark. "You were careless in the nicest possible way." He wanted to argue that he had always been careful, that love was not a reckless currency. Instead, he heard the hum of the diner's sign and the distant bark of a bike starting outside, an old habit, a neighborhood's heartbeat. The jukebox clattered to life with a song that felt like an omen. Marco understood then that he had, without intending it, affixed himself to a ledger that had margins written in red. He had married a widow who had kept a patch alive by making deals that flexed across decades, and in doing so, he had stitched his name into a scoreboard he had never read. There was a kind of shame that is quiet and long, like the drip of oil from a head gasket that only a mechanic recognizes. Marco felt that shame settle into the hollows of his collarbone. He loved Evelyn, not as an act of rebellion, but as something spiteful fate had given him when he thought he had nothing left to claim. He had not imagined that choosing tenderness could be a provocation. Evelyn touched the photograph on the wall, and then his hand. "We'll tell the boys the right story," she said. "But if you want to stand beside me, you have to learn the language of our enemies. And if you don't—" She left the sentence incomplete, as if the unspoken part was a wheel that could roll either way. "If you don't, you should return that ring.
I won't pull you into a war for my mistakes." Marco looked at his hand, at the gold band with the small heat mark beneath it. The choices lay before him like two roads splitting under a bridge: marry and risk being marked, or leave and keep his ignorance and perhaps his skin. The dilemma came sudden and sharp as a loose screw in a moving engine. To take his place beside Evelyn was to accept that his devotion could be weaponized. To step away was to abandon a woman who had dared to invite love at the edge of grief. He thought of the way she had looked at him when she said yes, of the way she'd run her fingertip along a piston like a benediction. He thought about how easy it had been to fall into the warmth of someone who had taught him to sleep in the presence of other people's wars. "Decide," Evelyn said gently. The diner hummed. Outside, the sound of a bike's engine was a distant heartbeat. "Decide if you'll be my husband or my target." The question landed with such finality that Marco's breath left him for a moment. He had the ring on his finger and 2 days of a life that felt like borrowed time to reconcile it. The question was an end and a beginning, an ultimatum wrapped in affection. He had married without understanding what his marriage would mean to the men who read honor like scripture and scored grudges in miles. Somewhere, between the hum of the Mion and the slow drip of coffee from an exhausted pot, a prospect in Evelyn's club received a message. A bike outside her shop would be found with its gas tank bashed in the night. A thin card would be left under a rocker arm like a coin on a grave. The road was already rewriting itself, and Marco, newly ringed and raw with uncertain devotion, was about to learn that being loved by a legend could make you the first bullet. I'll aim for a substantial, detailed continuation that develops revelations, conflicts, and the breaking of relationships as requested. Would you like me to continue now with that scene at a flexible length? I can target roughly 2,000–3,000 words. Evelyn's hands on the steering wheel of her truck were steady when she drove toward the mouth of the coast road, but her jaw moved like a piston. The garage behind her was a silhouette of things she couldn't unwrite. A row of bikes lined like sentinels, men who'd been boys under her husband's rule, now carrying her weight with the awkwardness of sons pressed into armor. Marco rode beside her on his own bike, fingers curled around the grips like a man learning to trust new roads. The ring on his finger caught sunlight sometimes and flashed like a small signal, the stubbornness of gold refusing to be quiet. They were leaving because remaining would be a trap. The bike with the bashed gas tank was a call she couldn't ignore. The thin card left under a rocker arm had not been a simple threat, but an invitation to an old ritual. Tomas Vega's men had the taste for spectacle. They liked to send a message by desecrating a machine, scarring the metal one owned like a mark across the face of a man. Mama Red kept her machines close enough that any wound to them felt like a knife to her own ribs. She'd seen worse, stitched others back together, but this was different. This cut had a name attached, and that name was now Marcos by the law of her people. "People are restless," said Raul, one of Evelyn's oldest prospects, falling in beside them. Raul rode with a dogged steadiness, his face a fold of stories and town gossip. "They don't like you bringing a husband into what's been a woman's protection, not the way Tomas sees it." Evelyn glanced at Marco. He had been listening, jaw set, the youngest of a kind of stubborn humility. She felt the tilt of something that had to be undone. An old ledger kept too close to the chest had to be opened, and she had been hoarding a hurt that would ask for blood now unless she unlatched it. "We will not be baited," she said. "We will not give him what he wants." "What's he want?" Marco asked. and his voice had lost the immediate tremor of diner confusion and instead carried a rough bravery, as if he had decided to carry his own fear out into the open. What happens if we just leave? If we go far enough, maybe he takes the lesson he thinks he needs. Evelyn let out a laugh that was only half humor. Tomas doesn't want you gone because he wants you away. He wants to break what I am. He wants to teach the coast that a widow's name isn't a safe harbor. If we leave, he wins the coast in principle. If we hide, he believes he has a shadow in his grasp. He will come back to carve at me. And then, one night, someone will not patch themselves up, and the ledger will get what it has been asking for. Marco swallowed. The ledger, her repository of favors and threatened returns, had always been a rumor to him, an artifact Evelyn used to hush the men. But now he tasted the ledger's truth like the bitter of overheated oil. If he wants to break you, why start with me? Because you are the most honest thing near me, Evelyn said, her voice low enough that the roar of the wind past their helmets swallowed some words. Because you made me soft in a way that looks like weakness to predators. Because you fucked a whole chain of things I had considered private. My right to grieve, my right to remain ferocious without apology. They stopped at the small cove where the road narrowed to a rusted bridge. Beyond it, the land opened into the stretch of coast that split territories, neutral ground that had once been written with small, precise lines. The bridge was a place of reckoning. It was where she had once brokered peace by letting two men ride toward each other until neither could feasibly hurt the other without incurring greater carnage. Now it would be where they chose whether to stand and face a man determined to redefine power with violence. "How do we make sure the boys don't act like the old way?" Marco asked when they parked, helmets off and hair whipped by the sea wind. His hands were roughened but steady as he unfastened the ring to let the salt air touch the skin that it warmed into pink. "You teach them that power without mercy is an empty road," Evelyn said. "You teach them by not handing the killing to a toddler who thinks himself a wolf. We fight our battles with rules, not with acts that leave us less than we were." She said it like a mantra, and Marco believed her partly because he had watched her keep rules she had never broken, and partly because he trusted the way she kept faith with others. Raoul and 3 others from the club formed a loose semicircle near the rail. Their faces were drawn and hard, ready to leap at a shout or a trigger, to be the kind of brotherhood that defended not just a name, but also the woman who had given them a road to follow. Evelyn stood in the middle like a lighthouse. When she spoke, they hesitated. "You told us to hold," she said. "You know why." They did. They had taken an oath to stand in the margins of her choices, to be tools shaped by her skill. But loyalty is a living thing, and sometimes it seeks the warmth of action instead of the cold of patience. The afternoon leaned into dusk when the bikes came, black silhouettes against shaping light, engines that made a sound like thunder rolled on a low drum. Tomas Vega rode at the lead, his jacket too sharp for his years, the red of his patch like a stained flag. He had assembled men who liked the idea of changing the coast as if shaping it with fists were a sport. His grin was pure triumph, the kind of thing that has no history of compassion behind it. Evelyn's hand went to the gun at her hip and then removed itself because she wanted no one to mistake a reflex for a decree. She hated guns for what she'd watched them do, but she kept one because strategy sometimes demanded a finality beyond conversation. Tomas slowed as he neared, the engine dying to a rasp. He stopped his bike a few yards away, dismounted with the practiced grace of someone who reveled in theatricality, and folded his arms. "Red," he called out, the name a throw. "You think you can hide behind someone else's stubbornness forever?" Evelyn's reply was a small sound like a tightened wire. If an enemy thinks I hide, they misunderstand the nature of a woman who has watched men die on a scoreboard. I keep things here because I have to. I never asked for applause. Tomas's laugh had teeth. She married a rookie, he said, loud enough for the men to hear. A pretty little mechanic. Didn't even know what they were signing up for. Guess the lady felt the need to soften things up. Marco could taste the scorn the way one tastes overheated metal. It had a metallic sense of wrongness. He felt it as a provocation meant to reorder him into a symbol. Something animal flared under his skin, a readiness to answer with an equal part of fury. He looked to Evelyn, waiting, because he wanted to know whether this was truly a path she had chosen. Evelyn's jaw had tightened into a determination that blurred the fine lines of grief on her face into something like resolution. "You don't get to lay claim to what we are," she said. "If you want to test us, you will do it by the rules. No assassinations, no kills of those who don't wear cloth between both houses, and no scalping of those who are women or children. We will talk. You want something? Sit." It was a treaty like a hand extended over a knife. Tomas's eyes flicked because he heard the challenge and suspected a weakness. "Talk." He spat the word like it left a rotten taste. "Talk is for those who are done with the road. I say we settle things differently, Red. Let's show who's on the coast." Marco moved then. He stepped out from behind Evelyn without thinking, an instinctive placing of himself between a woman who had placed herself on the map with a ledger and a man who would redraw borders with blood. "If you want blood, you get me," he said. His voice was even, but it bore a hardness as if something within him had learned to temper fear into steel. "Take me. Take the husband. Take the new piece, but you do not get to hurt anyone else." Tomas' grin widened. "Oh, a coward who wants to be brave," he said. "You think you're heroic? You think you'll be a better trophy than her patch?" He circled Marco like a shark measuring a new prey. "You're young. Maybe you don't know what it is to be real at this. We could teach you." Evelyn's expression tightened. "Don't," she said. A single-syllable command that was older than any of them. "If you want to test me, you test me with rules. If you want to test Marco, you get him through fair wager. Fight, but with a witness. No ambushes, no children, no women. If you do anything else, you'll have a coast full of people who will take your head apart." Tomas laughed again, and this time the laugh was a statement. "All right, Red, we accept. We'll meet at dawn on the rusted bridge 3 leagues north. 1 man each. No artillery, no interference. If your man wins, we sign a truce. If my man wins, you hand over your ledger and fold your patch." The declaration landed like a gauntlet. Evelyn's eyes narrowed at Marco, assessing him as if he'd been a tool she hadn't yet learned to use. "You can refuse," she said. "You don't have to play." Marco had known fear. He'd also known what it felt like to be protected. He had been protected by choices Evelyn had made for him for a past stretch, but he had not expected to be offered as consequence to her sins. The choice to accept the duel had come unbidden, but neat, like a bolt that finally found a thread. He heard the men behind him, their breaths and small murmurs. Some muttered in favor, some against. Rawls' hand found his shoulder and squeezed like an anchor. "To take a wife's place is not to be a toy," Marco said. "If I fight for us, not for your ledger." Evelyn met his eyes across the span and saw a man who had chosen a road that echoed like a bell ringing through fog. "Then we make the rules clear," she said. "No lethal force unless consented afterward. A winner is declared by the referee on site, the man who can render the other unable to continue. We will set the terms." Tomas agreed. He liked rules, as long as he believed he would write the end. Marco's repentance had been a mirror he didn't want to break. Night seemed in like a slow stitch. They camped at a safe distance, men keeping fires and keeping watch. The next morning, the bridge would decide more than a score. It would decide whether Evelyn would have to give up the ledger, or whether Tomas would have to learn that a coast cannot be reshaped by the temper of one man's fury. Yet, even as the men made pacts of watches and the wind took the last of the cigarette smoke up to the gulls, Evelyn went to her truck and opened the glove box. Inside, beneath a handkerchief and a spare flashlight, was a leather-bound book. Marco followed her with uncertain steps. The ledger smelled of oil and old ink and the faint ghost of cigar smoke. It was smaller than he expected, more intimate, and the scrawl inside it was a map of debts and claims, so raw that reading it felt like walking through a graveyard where each headstone had a name and an accounting. "You don't have to show it to me," Marco said, because he knew better than to ask for something that would wound her. Seeing it was betray, knowing it was responsibility. "I don't have the right." Evelyn looked at him with a thin expression he couldn't quite parse.
"You already have it," she said. "You married me. You made yourself mine. Now you will see what that cost." Her hands shook just enough as she opened the ledger and turned the pages. She read then, not aloud, but in a voice that sounded like the turning of gears. It was not the names that made his breath stop. He expected names, debts, promises, but the notation beside some of them. Repentance claimed, sight secured, children spared. The ledger was full of small mercies written in a handwriting that remembered too many things. He read the name of a man he'd known in the shop, a prospect who had disappeared to another patch and had come back with a scar. He read about loans that had been paid in services and favors, and about nights where Evelyn had met other club's leaders to bargain for safety, exchanging the names of those who would be left untouched for goods and passage. "I made promises," she said softly. "Sometimes I made bargains with monsters to keep our people breathing. I paid in favors I thought would never be called back. And once, when I was certain a border skirmish would end a boy's life, I made a trade that belonged to the ledger. I gave away a man's right to expect mercy. I signed the note and told myself it was for the greater good." Marco listened, and his admiration for her, sharp and incandescent, shifted into sorrow. He had married a woman who had been forced to choose between the lesser of two evils enough times that it had become a language. "Who?" he asked. "Who did you give away?" Her eyes were rims of night. "We let a man go to the border who should have been kept from it," she said. "We promised reprieve to a family in exchange for silence. We turned our heads in ways that left others exposed. I did things to make sure my club survived. I thought I could hold the ledger so no one else would need to bleed. I thought that if I kept tally, I could stop the scale from tipping." Marco's throat tightened. The ledger was not just accounting. It was an archive of moral bargains. So why did Tomas have the right to ask for it? "Because he believes," Evelyn said flatly, "that possessing that ledger will prove he can break me. He thinks if he holds the names, he can unmake what I've made. If he gets it, he will dangling people's lives like keys in a market. It will make him the man who decides who lives and who dies. It will let him use fear as a highway." Marco pressed his palm flat on the paper as if he could feel the ink like a pulse. "And the fight? The fight is a script of honor," she said, and the tiredness in her voice was bone deep. "If we let it slide into an ambush, we have handed him what he wants. If we refuse, he will escalate. If we accept a duel, we make him play by rules he will resent but cannot easily break without losing face.
It's the best shot at leveling power. But that ledger, I'll give it willingly if I must. The thing is, I can't give it if the price is your blood." Something raw and ragged opened in Marco. "Then we need another currency," he said. "If he wants proof that he can break you, he can be offered something that proves he hasn't won. We can offer a trade, something that costs but doesn't make us disappear." Evelyn's brow creased. "What?" "Your ledger goes into trust," Marco said, surprising himself with the audacity of his concept. "We put it somewhere safe. An independent hand, someone neutral we both respect, keeps it until the coast agrees not to use documents like it as weapons. The ledger will not be a prize. It will be a relic. Tomas can't break what can't be held." Evelyn considered him as if she were weighing a bolt between her fingers for fit. "You think we can find a neutral party? I know one." Marco ran his thumb around the edge of the leather. "Sister Cruz. She runs the clinic in Santa Mar. Doesn't ride, won't take sides, but she does take oaths. She remembers names for the living, not for transactions. If she has it, it becomes a book for our dead and not a lever for mem." Raoul, listening, grunted a laugh that was almost a sound of relief. "That's heresy, but it's clever." Tomas's presence on the other side of the bridge moved like a shadow. He stepped forward as if to interrupt, but Evelyn cut him with a glance. "We'll negotiate," she said. "We can offer that. If you accept, then you must agree to a restraint. The ledger becomes untouchable, sealed in trust. If you refuse, the duel stays." Tomas narrowed his eyes. He was a man who liked to make others feel the drag of impotence. To refuse was to insist on a spectacle. He could not have that. A woman in her 60s outmaneuvered him with a plan that did not involve steel. But the truth of the ledger's removal from the field, its rendering ineffectual in power, was a blow he hadn't expected. It took away the theater he had hoped to produce for his men. He weighed the options: a duel that might end with his glory, or an agreement that left his hands free and his options limited. He chose his hubris. He chose the duel. "Make your arrangements," he said. "We meet at dawn." The night that followed was the kind of hush that preludes storms. Men drank in low silence, and Evelyn prepared herself with a meticulousness that was almost ritual. She wrapped her hands with tape like a prayer, not for the gun, but for control. Marco watched her with an intensity that made his chest ache. This was the woman he had vowed to stand beside, and she had become the lever upon which countless lives tilted. He wanted to do something witty or heroic, and instead found himself cleaning a wrench until his knuckles bled. It was the small acts that steadied him. A socket tightened, a chain oiled. Each motion was a promise. He would not be spared from the truth he had chosen to step into. Dawn came thin and gray. Mist sat low over the water like a hand over a sleeping face. The bridge, old iron and the smell of rust awaited them, and men from other clubs had gathered at edges like vultures curious for blood. Evelyn was there, in a jacket that had the patch but not the gauntness of someone ready to die. She had chosen life enough to still want to live. Marco stood across from Tomas, gloves off, fists bare except for tape binding knuckles and a new bruise already forming near his eye. "Remember the rules," Evelyn said, voice crackling like old radio. "We do this clean. No knives, no guns, 1 hour. A witness. Raoul is the referee." Tomas spat and nodded, and a hush fell. The first bell hit the iron of the bridge like the beginning of an execution. They circled. Marco thought he would feel fear. Instead, he felt a crystalline clarity, a shock of awareness that he was standing not just for himself, but for the choice he had made to be Evelyn's companion. He thought about the ledger in the truck, carried now by Raoul to a waiting van that would take it to Sister Cruz if the bargaining held. He thought of Evelyn's hands on engines, of her singing to metal like she sang a benediction. He thought of the men who looked at him with hope that he would not break. The first contact was brutal and simple, a test of balance and will. Tomas hit with a swing that had the confidence of a man who had never been truly tested. Marco ducked instinctively and felt the sting of pain at his temple as the heel of Tomas's hand connected. The world narrowed to breath and the countenance of the man facing him. Marco answered with a strike that landed under Tomas's ribs, sweet and yielding. They traded moves like two machines in repair, hands finding faults and adjusting. Each hit left a bruise and a story, and they measured the other with their bodies. Around them men called counts, and Evelyn watched like a hawk, every crease in her face meaning measurement. Marco fought not to let his fear dictate his attacks, and he fought not to feel triumph. He wanted to end the match with the kind of dignity that wouldn't feed Tomas's hunger for spectacle. The bridge was a thin theater, and Marco's heart was a metronome. Tomas was better at taut cruelty than at endurance. He had the advantage in reach and a certain mercilessness, but Marco had stamina and an unorthodox resilience honed by knights fixing engines with frozen fingers. He moved in ways Tomas did not expect, found gaps where the other's anger left vulnerabilities. After long minutes of trading, Tomas missed a step near the rail, and Marco exploited the opening with a sweep that knocked Tomas down. The crowd gasped. Tomas rose, seething, and came at Marco like a hornet. Marco, feeling a surge that wasn't only adrenaline but a fierce protective love, sidestepped and took Tomas's momentum, unbalancing him in a way that left him on the deck, panting. Raoul stepped forward and declared a pause. Tomas panted through the sound like a dog that had lost its bark. A hush fell. "You win by inability to continue," Raoul said. Tomas patted his chest as if to find the heart still thrumming. His face contorted with rage, but also with an education he had not expected. He had been bested not by death, but by endurance and steadiness, the very things he had thought beneath him. "Give the ledger," Tomas spat, but his voice had lost its edge. "If you wanted to humble me, you have. If you want to be magnanimous, hand it over." Evelyn's face was unreadable, but when she turned to Marco, she found his hand extended. "Are you sure?" she asked, in a sound that was unsteady. Marco felt the ledger like a promise between them. He had learned to shoulder responsibility that did not belong to his years by living through Evelyn's choices. "Yes," he said. "We keep the ledger where it can't be used as a weapon. We trust Sister Cruz to hold it." Tomas roared like a wounded animal, but the roar had lost its spark. His men, seeing their leader's loss, felt the tremor of a shift that had nothing to do with a ledger and everything to do with the legitimacy of the coast. Tomas could not attack now without being the one who had broken the rules. He ground his teeth and walked away, leaving a silence like the space after a gunshot. When the men dispersed, Evelyn took Marco into her arms like a woman lighter for having borne a weight. He felt it as a kind of surrender and rescue at once. She smelled of salt and engine oil and something like old roses. "You didn't have to," she murmured. "I did," Marco said. He pressed his forehead against her temple, the bridge's iron cool and durable beneath their feet. "You're mine. I'm not your trophy. I never wanted to be one." She laughed, a wet, incredulous sound. "I almost made you one," she admitted. "Almost." They rode back to the shop in the pale of morning, and the ledger was sealed in a box that Raoul insisted on taking to Sister Cruz immediately. The coast breathed a collective exhale. Power had not been taken from the hands that had forged it, but a language had been reintroduced, one where bargains could be made into relics and no longer used for blackmail. It was a fragile peace. It was, perhaps, the most stubborn kind there was. That evening, After the men had done their rounds and the garage was quiet, Evelyn sat at the workbench and opened a drawer. She took out an old photograph, her husband, younger and laughing in a leather jacket, an arm slung over her shoulders, and then held it in both hands. Marco watched her, the dim lamp throwing edges across his own features. "You don't have to keep the ledger for life," Marco said softly. "You can still love the memory without carrying the cost. Sister Cruz will keep it. We'll go and visit it like a shrine once in a while and then leave it be." Evelyn's eyes glistened. "People expect me to be the ledger," she said. "They expect a widow to be a ledger or a fortress. I wanted to be both and something else too. I wanted a hand in mine that wasn't a bandage." Marco touched her fingers, feeling the ridges the years had made. He slid the ring back onto his hand. "Then let's be something else," he said. "Let's be soft and dangerous. Let's be a garage with a kettle and a woman who can laugh again." Her smile broke like sunrise. It was not a victory smile. It was the kind you give when you feel raw and still choose to keep living. "We'll rebuild," she said, "but we will be careful with our tenderness. We will not hand it to a man like Tomas to turn into a weapon." And so they did the next hard thing. They chose to be ordinary together. They reopened the ledger's drawer to take out the names they could still pay back with small acts. One debt repaid with a new tire, another with a visit and an apology from a man too proud to ask. They repaired fences and bikes and misgivings. The men in the club breathed easier, not because the truth was easy, but because an honest paper had become a shared shame rather than a club's threat. The coast learned, slowly, that a ledger could not be used to hold people hostage if the community decided the book belonged to memory instead of leverage. Weeks later, when the ledger sat behind Sister Cruz's locked cabinet and Marco and Evelyn visited with a pot of coffee and an offering of tuna sandwiches, small human things, Evelyn wept. The tears were not all for grief. Some were for the relief of not being the sole keeper of a town's sins. She laughed a little when Sister Cruz fussed and told her to wipe her face. "You could take that back," Marco said, hand in hers. "You could keep it if you wanted. But wouldn't you rather see what else is in your hands?" She squeezed him until his fingers hurt. "I'd rather see what we make together," she said, and the words were an oath. Reconstruction is an act of devotion. It is done in kitchens and in the grease-stained cuffs of sleeves, in the minutes between closing the garage and opening a bottle. Marco and Evelyn built a new rhythm, one where the ledger was no longer a weapon, where their love had been hard-won and therefore less likely to be squandered. They fought sometimes. They made up with a ferocity that matched the fights. He learned the language of the coast, the nuance of threats, the ways insults could be repaired, and she learned to let someone else bear bits of what she had once been forced to hoard. Tomas Vegas' anger curdled into something else, a study in lost opportunities. He tried to rebuild his influence, but the men who had once listened for his thunder found other things to occupy their ears. The sound of Sister Cruz's church bells signaling respite, the laughter of men who had stopped holding their breath. Tomas drifted toward small crimes and angrier men, until one night a confrontation in another town ended his rise. Power, after all, is not a monolith. It fractures where pride is too thin. Months after the duel, Marco sat outside the garage with a cup of coffee as Evelyn tuned a motor. The sea air wrapped around them the way old friends wrap themselves in an understanding. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, surprising himself by the fragility of the question. Evelyn paused, wrench in hand, and looked at him with the gravity of someone who has learned to weigh a life like a scale. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but regret is a bad map. We can navigate with it, but we cannot live by it. What I regret most is that I think I taught you to be brave by making you bear burdens. I should have taught you to choose kindness on purpose." Marco smiled, the way a man lets sunlight in after a storm. "You taught me to fight well," he said, "and to love the smell of old engines." She laughed and reached for his hand. He slid his ring off and replaced it on the same finger. No announcement, no ceremony, just a small, quiet confirmation that the road they'd made was a shared one. The ring felt warm, not as a symbol of ownership, but as something that had traveled many miles of waking and choosing. Weeks later, Sister Cruz returned the ledger, not as an instrument of war, but as a book bound with a note. For remembrance, not for sale. To be read only by those who will make reparations. Evelyn kept the ledger in a safe she shared with the club, accessible to those who had nursed the wounds it contained and willing to pay them back with acts that were restorative, not punitive. Names were expunged and apologies logged. The ledger became a book of community repair, names beside actions, not threats. The coast changed, not in the way an earthquake reorders a shoreline, but more like the patient work of tides smoothing a rough stone. People who had been afraid to speak found a steadier voice. Marco and Evelyn learned to be wary but not fearful, to trust but verify. Where once patches flared with dangerous pride, more clubs leaned towards something better, agreements that were written in public, not in secret. One evening, years later, Marco sat at the counter of the diner where he'd found himself married. He pinched the skin at the base of his thumb and found the faint mark the ring had left him, a small scar that felt like belonging. Evelyn sat across from him with her hand wrapped around a mug of tea. She wore a jacket that had softened with age and the phoenix patch shining like an ember. They were older in ways that mattered, eyes that had grown crinkled with laughter and worry, but they were also younger in some fierce way, because tenderness had taught them a bravery that violence never could. "You ever miss the ledger as a lever?" Marco asked. She considered it. "Sometimes I miss the illusion of control," she said, "but not the ledger itself." The ledger kept track of human frailty. It needed to become a tool for mending, not a club for beating. We learned to trade blood for work. We learned to buy back what we'd lost with kindness. They held hands then, the way two people who had stared down the same danger would, with the easy, tough certainty of those who had chosen each other as refuge and as challenge. The road in front of them shimmered with possible miles. Behind them lay a ledger rewritten with apologies, paid in meals, in repaired houses, in the names of children kept from harm. On that stretch of coast, the legend of Mama Red shifted from the woman who kept a ledger to the woman who made it a book of repair. Men still told stories about grudges and gunsmoke, but the stories softened like leather in the sun. Love between two people who had been caught in the crossfire was no longer a provocation, but an example of what could be chosen. To be brave, to forgive, to make restitution. The final reckoning had been less a spectacle than a slow repair. Marco's willingness to stand had not made the world safe, but it had made possible a different road. One where a husband and a widow could be a patch for other lives instead of a target. The ledger's ink had dried into margins of memory rather than maps for ambushes. Tomas Vega learned the hard lesson that breaking a woman's name did not mean you could break the people who loved her. And on nights when the ocean sang against the cliffs and bikes rolled like old hymns along the coast, Marco and Evelyn sat on the porch of the garage and watched the world pass by. They had traded fear for fierce trust, a net they had woven themselves. The ledger, now a relic of both their guilt and their redemption, sat in a place that honored its past use and rebuked it. The road asked its price, and together they had paid it, with scars and with kindness, with sacrifice and with the quiet work of choosing each other again and again. They learned to measure safety not by the ledger's silence, but by small daily proofs. A warm kettle, a repaired bike held for a neighbor, a name crossed out and replaced with a good deed.
The garage hummed, the clink of sockets, the smell of oil, Evelyn singing, threading the afternoon like benediction. Marco's hands grew steadier. Evelyn let her laughter break easier. In town, they were trusted because they'd stood when standing counted. Sometimes old ghosts rode past as scabbed rumors or men with Thomas hard edges. But most of those storms passed. Thomas' name shrank into a cautionary tale told to prospect kids. Don't let pride make a tyrant. When men needed settlement, they came to the bridge in daylight instead of leaving notes under rocker arms. The coast learned consequences could be public and reparations real. Evelyn taught informal evenings where younger women learned to wrench and to negotiate, to hold strategy as a tool, not a weapon. Marco built an apprentice program, mixing mechanics with mediation. He'd seen that fixing engines and grudges were patient work. They married again under an open sky, not for spectacle, but for themselves. Vows acknowledged debts and pledged a future stitched with repair. Sister Cruz read words about mercy. Raoul officiated with the solemn relief of a man who'd watched worse choices. The ledger sat at the edge of the celebration, not a prize, but an artifact cupped in wool, pages softened and power neutralized. On slow nights, they kept a seat at the diner counter for kids who needed warmth and someone to hear them. They repaid debts with work crews repairing roofs and replacing windows for those left vulnerable. Each restitution was cataloged, not in ink for leverage, but in a small book recording apologies and the follow-through. The final image was simple: Evelyn teaching a young woman the gentle art of balancing a carburetor while Marco wiped his hands and listened to the sea. Beyond them, the road rolled on, imperfect and honest, and their shadows fell long on the pavement like two people who had earned the right to walk beside each other. At dusk, they left the porch light on and kept a kettle warm, offering coffee to any rider who needed a hand. The coast changed. They paid costs together, willingly, with repair, apology, and the slow work of forgiveness that outlasts noise and time.